I thought Daniel was calling to tell me dinner would be late. I thought the tremor in his voice was nothing more than traffic, or the exhaustion that had been building in him for weeks, or maybe the bad cell signal we always got near the highway overpass on his commute home. I was standing in our kitchen, the one I had repainted pale sage green on a long weekend 2 summers ago, the color I had agonized over for 3 days, holding paint chips up to the afternoon light until I found the exact shade that made the room feel like somewhere you could breathe. Stirring a pot of risotto and humming something I couldn't even name, completely unaware that the next 5 words out of my husband's mouth were about to demolish 3 years of carefully constructed peace. He said it almost conversationally, the way you mention that you forgot to buy milk, the way you say, "Oh, by the way," before something that turns out to be anything but casual. "By the way, Mom and Derek are moving in on Saturday." Not a question, not a discussion, not, "What do you think?" or "I've been meaning to bring something up." Just a flat, declarative sentence, a fait accompli wrapped in the ordinary warmth of his voice. And I stood there with the wooden spoon dripping arborio rice onto the stovetop, while the world I had built, quietly, irreparably, cracked down the middle. Because here is the part that made it worse. Here is the detail that transformed a shock into something that felt, in the cold architecture of later reflection, like betrayal at its most precise and deliberate. Derek was 37 years old, not 19 and in between apartments, not freshly divorced and needing a month to land on his feet. 37. He had been living in Patricia's house since his last girlfriend had packed her things and left 8 years ago. And in all those 8 years, no one had ever seemed to expect anything different of him. He didn't pay rent. He didn't cook or clean or offer anything to any household he occupied beyond his physical presence, which occupied itself primarily with a gaming console and an inexhaustible appetite for delivered food. And now Daniel, my husband, the man who had stood across from me at the altar and promised, with real feeling in his voice, to build a life with me, to be my partner in every sense of that word, had apparently decided, alone, in some conversation I had not been invited to, that our apartment was the obvious and natural solution to whatever problem he had decided his mother and brother represented. He had made this decision across several weeks. He had executed the logistics, had presumably measured the guest room, mapped out sleeping arrangements, identified a timeline, without saying a single word to me. And when I asked him, "When did you decide this?" he paused just a half-second too long and said, "A few weeks ago." A few weeks. He had known for weeks. Our apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in a neighborhood that had taken us 6 months to find. I remember the day we signed the lease as a physical memory, not just visual, but sensory. The weight of those papers in my hands, the smell of the real estate office that afternoon, the way Daniel had squeezed my shoulder when the landlord handed us the keys, the clean white silence of the empty rooms the first time we walked through them with the knowledge that they were ours. I was 29 then. I had spent most of my late 20s saving with a discipline that wasn't always easy or joyful, skipping the vacations my friends took, eating lunches I packed myself in containers I'd washed and refilled 50 times, saying no to things I would have liked in order to accumulate enough to say yes to something real and lasting. The apartment was that yes. It wasn't large, but it was ours in a way that felt earned, and I had poured myself into making it feel like home, with the particular energy of someone who has waited a long time for something and intends to honor it. The kitchen was where I had invested the most. Pale sage walls, copper-bottomed pans hanging from a rack Daniel had installed on a Sunday when we were both in the mood for projects. A window above the sink that caught the western light at 4 in the afternoon and turned everything in the room a specific shade of warm gold that I had come to think of as the apartment's signature. I kept fresh herbs on the windowsill, basil and thyme in small terracotta pots, the soil always faintly damp, the smell of them rising whenever I brushed against them while washing dishes. The living room doubled as my home office in the mornings, with a desk tucked against the east wall and a bookshelf holding both work references and novels with broken spines, the ones I'd read more than once. The second bedroom was small, a daybed, a narrow closet, a bookshelf of overflow volumes, and not remotely designed to absorb two adults and the accumulated weight of two adult lives. Daniel and I had met at a work conference 4 years before this story begins. He was in logistics consulting. I managed projects for a firm that handled commercial renovations. We were both reaching for the last of the good pastries at the same moment, and he had made some dry, self-aware joke about the conference catering that made me laugh in a way I wasn't expecting. Not a polite laugh, but an actual one, surprised out of me. We dated for 14 months before he proposed. Our first 2 years of marriage had been genuinely good in the quieter way of people who are actually comfortable together, who can be in the same room without talking and not feel the weight of silence, who have reached the part of a relationship where you stop performing and simply exist alongside each other, which is both less romantic and more real than anything that came before. His flaw, which I had always known and cataloged with the honest clarity of someone who has decided to love a person despite their limitations, was that he was conflict avoidant in a way that went beyond preference into something structural. He had been shaped by a childhood in which keeping the peace with Patricia was the primary emotional currency, and that had made him a person who smoothed rather than resolved, who gave vague, reassuring answers when specifics were needed, who chose the path of least resistance so reliably that I had, over time, simply stopped expecting him to choose differently. Patricia was 62, widowed 12 years earlier, and she had organized the entire architecture of her emotional life around her 2 sons. What was particular to her was the precision of it, the way her warmth for Daniel existed alongside a quiet, unrelenting surveillance of anything she perceived as competing with her influence over him. She called every Sunday. She forwarded articles about home maintenance, cooking, financial planning, with subject lines that read, "Thought you might like this," but which always, if you traced the subtext carefully, implied that the household Daniel was running might benefit from some adjustment. She had opinions about my curtains, delivered as gentle observations. She had opinions about the brand of coffee I bought, mentioned in passing. She had, once, rearranged the items in my refrigerator while helping prepare a Thanksgiving dinner, and then looked pleasantly surprised when I noticed. I had said nothing. I had smiled and told myself I was being oversensitive. This was my longest-running error with Patricia, mistaking deliberate action for unconscious habit, and then mistaking my discomfort for oversensitivity. Derek I knew largely by his outline, the shape he made at family gatherings, the short sentences, the phone always in his hand, the general impression of someone who had stopped expecting effort to be required of him and had arranged his life accordingly. He and I had exchanged perhaps 300 words total across 4 years of technically being family. He called me Clara when he needed to use my name, which was rarely. He ate generously at any table I set and thanked me afterward in a tone that was neither warm nor dismissive, but simply automatic, the way you thank someone for holding a door. This was the person my husband had decided should occupy my guest room, without once asking whether I agreed. The warning signs had been gathering for weeks before the phone call, individual threads I had not yet pulled into a pattern. In retrospect, the shape they form is unmistakable. At the time, I filed them under separate headings: oddities, passing irritations, things that didn't quite add up, but never quite enough to constitute anything worth naming. This is the particular cruelty of slow-motion betrayal. It gives you just enough information to be uneasy and never quite enough to be certain, and it relies on you filling the gap between those two states with the benefit of the doubt. It started with a Sunday call in late October that ran 90 minutes instead of the usual 30. I came home from a long run and found Daniel still at the kitchen table, his coffee gone cold beside him. His voice dropped to something low and deliberate that I registered as unusual from the doorway. He turned when he heard my key in the lock. He smiled. He said, "Talk soon, Mom," and set the phone down with a carefulness that I noticed and did not name. I asked what they'd talked about. He said, "Oh, just stuff. She's been having a hard time lately." I poured myself a glass of water and did not press. I had learned over 4 years that pressing about Patricia rarely yielded more than a wall upholstered in warmth. 2 weeks later, I checked the household Wi-Fi management app on my phone. Daniel had set up a smart router when we moved in, and the app logged every device that connected to our network, and found Derek's phone listed as having connected on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:15. I was at work at 2:15 on Tuesdays. I was always at work on Tuesday afternoons. Derek had been in our apartment while I was not. I mentioned it to Daniel that evening, keeping my tone neutral. He said Derek had stopped by to borrow a drill. I looked toward the hallway closet. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself there was no reason to treat a borrowed drill as evidence of anything larger. I made tea and went to bed. I did not sleep well. This was when the quiet insomnia began, surfacing at 3 a.m. with a formless sense that something was wrong, running through the inventory of my life like a flashlight beam moving through a dark room, never finding the specific source of the wrongness, but feeling its presence all the same, the way you smell rain before a single drop has fallen. The third warning came in early November, when Patricia visited for what was described as a casual Saturday lunch. She arrived 20 minutes early, before I had finished cleaning, and she moved through the apartment with a slow and particular quality of attention that I recognized, in the moment, for just a second, as something slightly different from ordinary curiosity. She stood in the doorway of the guest room longer than a visitor typically would. She commented on how much closet space there was. Wasn't that nice for a second bedroom? And then asked with breezy offhandedness whether we'd ever thought about making that room more practical in the meantime, since we didn't have children yet. I said we liked having the space for guests. She said, of course, naturally. She ate lunch and was warm and funny and helped clear the plates, and when she left, she gave me a hug that lasted exactly 1 second longer than usual. I stood in the kitchen afterward and stared at the copper pan hanging above the stove, and I had a sudden, vivid bodily sensation, the kind that bypasses thought and lands directly in the sternum, that something had just been assessed, that the apartment, the guest room, the closet space had all been looked at and found, in someone's private and careful calculation, sufficient. I turned on the tap, washed the lunch dishes, let the water carry the feeling downstream the way I always did. I was very practiced at this by then. The call came on a Wednesday evening just past 6. The kitchen was warm and golden, the risotto halfway through, the smell of white wine and Parmesan and sautéed shallots thick in the air. I had the phone propped against the herb pots on the windowsill, and I answered without putting down the spoon because I was certain, with the comfortable, thoughtless certainty of someone whose life has been predictable long enough to take that predictability for granted, that this was going to be a call about something ordinary. There was a half-second of silence before he spoke. I have replayed that half-second many times since. It is the length of a hesitation. It is the length of a choice being made. "By the way," Daniel said, "Mom and Derek are moving in on Saturday." I set the spoon down on the rest beside the stove with a slowness that was almost ceremonial. I turned the heat down. The amber light outside the window held its particular beauty over the city, while something inside me went quiet in a way that didn't feel like calm. I asked him to say it again. He repeated it with details. They needed to be out of Patricia's house by end of the month, something about a landlord and structural repairs. It was only temporary, 3 months at most. He had already worked out the sleeping arrangements. It was fine. It was going to be absolutely fine. He just needed me to be flexible, just needed me to understand that you did these things for family, that he knew I understood that. "Daniel," I said, using the voice I kept for difficult client meetings, the voice that communicated, "I am not flustered and I am not going to be managed. When did you decide this?" The pause that followed was fractionally too long. It was the pause of someone who has rehearsed an answer and discovers at the moment of delivery that it sounds less reasonable out loud than it did in their head. "A few weeks ago," he said. "I was going to bring it up. I just wanted to have the details sorted first, so it wouldn't seem so overwhelming. I wanted to make it easier for you." Make it easier for me. As if the only conceivable problem with moving two adults into our home without my knowledge or consent was that I might find the logistics stressful. As if our marriage were a project he was managing, and I were a stakeholder whose anxieties needed smoothing, rather than a partner whose agreement was required. As if the 3 or 4 weeks he had spent in private arrangements, while I cooked dinners and slept beside him and asked how his day had been, and believed in my bones that we were building something together, were simply a reasonable communication strategy rather than the thing they actually were. "I'll talk to you when you get home," I said. I hung up. I turned off the stove. I stood in my gold-lit kitchen in front of the risotto I had made for two and looked at the copper pan hanging above the stove and understood, for the first time, not fully because the full understanding would take weeks and carry a weight far heavier than a phone call, that decisions were being made inside my own walls and my voice was not in them. I pressed my palm flat against the cool granite of the counter and breathed, and I thought, I need to know exactly what has already been decided and by whom and how long this has been in motion. I was not angry yet. Anger requires clarity. What I felt in that moment was quieter and colder and in some ways worse. The particular loneliness of standing in a room you have made beautiful and realizing for the first time that someone else has already decided what it will be used for. Daniel came home at 7:45. I heard his key in the lock and did not get up from the kitchen table, where I had been sitting for 90 minutes with a glass of water I hadn't touched and the cold risotto still in the pot on the stove. The apartment smelled of congealed Parmesan and something cooler underneath it, the particular smell of a room where someone has been thinking very hard and very quietly for a long time. He came through the hallway and stopped in the doorway when he saw me. He was still in his work jacket. His tie was loosened in the familiar way that, under any other circumstance, would have made me feel the ordinary warmth of his return. I told him to sit down. He sat. He set his bag on the floor with the deliberate movements of someone trying to communicate that they are not a threat, and I asked him to explain it to me from the beginning. Not the version he had given me on the phone, the actual beginning. Whose idea it had been, what exactly had been agreed to, how many weeks ago it had started. He talked for several minutes with his eyes moving between my face and the table surface, the way they did when he was gauging how much trouble he was in. The story was this. His mother had told him weeks back that her landlord required all tenants to vacate for structural repairs. She had nowhere to go. Derek had nowhere to go independently. Daniel had looked at our spare room and made what he described as a logical, temporary, family-oriented decision. He said he had wanted to have a plan ready before he told me, so it would feel more manageable to me. He said that word, manageable, and I thought, that is not a word you use for a conversation with your equal. That is a word you use for a situation you are administering. We talked for 2 hours. By 9:30, he had mistaken my silence for resolution. He kissed my forehead before bed. I lay awake until 2 in the morning, thinking about the word temporary and how many things that started as temporary had never ended. They arrived on Saturday at 10 in the morning with a rented van and considerably more furniture than I had been led to expect. What appeared in my hallway was a migration. Stacked boxes, a flat-screen television larger than ours, a reclining armchair, a mini-fridge still in its shipping box, and Patricia's collection of decorative objects, figurines, framed photographs, a carved wooden clock she placed on the living room shelf within 20 minutes, setting my succulent arrangement aside without asking, without comment, with the calm authority of someone who has already decided the space is at least partly hers. Derek disappeared behind the guest room door within the hour, headset on, delivered food ordered. Patricia made tea in my kitchen with the ease of someone who has either done this before or intends to do it many more times, talking warmly about how grateful she was, how temporary this all was, how she had always thought of me as a daughter. She said this with a hand on my arm and an expression of sincere tenderness that I found more unsettling than anything else, because I had learned to hear what Patricia communicated beneath the warmth of her actual words. By evening, the apartment felt different. The rooms that had been ours had become shared, without a conversation, without a negotiation, without the basic courtesy of being asked. I sat on our bed that night with the door closed and felt, for the first time, like a guest in my own home. The first real crack came 9 days later. I had come home from work early, a meeting had finished ahead of schedule, and I let myself in quietly to find Patricia in the kitchen, not in her usual warm commentary mode, but in a lower, more careful register, speaking into her phone. I stood in the hallway with my coat still on and listened. I caught fragments, lease and second name, and how long would that take? And then, clearly and unmistakably, my husband's name. Daniel says it shouldn't be a problem if it's framed correctly. A pause. No, she doesn't know about that part yet. I stood in the hallway for another 30 seconds and felt the floor of the familiar become suddenly uncertain beneath me. The way a step you trust reveals itself to be hollow. I walked back out of the apartment as quietly as I had entered it, sat in the stairwell 2 floors below with my back against the cold, painted concrete wall, and thought very carefully about what I had just heard. She doesn't know about that part yet. The lease, a second name, something framed correctly, my husband's explicit cooperation. This was not a woman taking advantage of a son's generosity. This was a plan with moving parts, and Daniel was one of them. I requested a copy of the lease from our property management company the next morning, calling from my office, my voice pleasant and entirely unremarkable. It arrived by early afternoon. I opened it at my desk with the door closed and my hands completely steady, the steadiness that comes not from the absence of emotion, but from the presence of something cold and focused taking emotion's place. My name was listed as the primary leaseholder, as always, because I had been the one with the stronger credit history when we applied. Daniel was secondary. What was not expected, what required me to read it 3 times before my mind would fully process it, was a third name, an authorized occupant added by an amendment filed 8 days earlier, signed by Daniel, Patricia Marlowe. My mother-in-law had been formally added to my lease without my knowledge, without my signature, without a single word spoken to me. Because Daniel was a secondary leaseholder with the technical authority to authorize occupants, the amendment was, in the dry language of property law, valid. She was not a guest. She was, on paper, a resident, with every legal protection that word implies. I sat at my desk and looked at that name on the screen and felt the shape of the plan finally in its entirety. The landlord story? I believed none of it now. The November visit, the slow survey of the guest room, the comment about the closet space, the weeks of private arrangements, the amendment filed while I was at work, the son who had been trained from boyhood to resolve his mother's problems before he considered his wife's objections. This had not been a crisis Daniel had responded to. This had been a plan he had participated in. The distinction was not small. The distinction was everything. I did not confront Daniel that evening. I did something harder and more useful. I called Sophie, who was a paralegal. I called my father, who told me to find a property attorney and say nothing to Daniel until I had. And I called Helen Park, who had an opening the following afternoon and who said, when I explained the situation, that this was not the first time she had heard a story structured exactly this way. Helen reviewed the amendment, confirmed it was challengeable on the basis that the primary leaseholder had not consented, and raised something I hadn't considered. Patricia's formal resident status would make her harder to remove the longer it stood unchallenged. The amendment was not sentimental territory marking. It was a legal foothold, deliberately placed. I slept that night with a clarity I had not felt in months. Not peace, but direction, which is considerably more useful. The confrontation happened on a Thursday evening, 12 days after their arrival. I had asked Daniel to sit at the kitchen table after dinner. Patricia was in the living room. I set my phone on the table between us, opened the lease amendment, and pushed it across to him without a word. "Explain this to me." He looked at it. A muscle moved in his jaw. He looked up with the expression of someone deciding how much of the truth to offer and in what order. He said he had been going to tell me. He said his mother had asked him to file it because without formal status, she felt precarious. He said he had thought it was a protection for her, not an imposition on me. He had not, he admitted, thought about what it meant for my rights. He had not thought about me at all in the framing of it. "You added someone to my lease without asking me," I said, "and you were going to explain it later." He said he knew how it sounded. "Tell me her landlord's name," I said, "the one who forced her out for structural repairs." Silence. "Tell me the building company doing the work." More silence. And in that silence, Patricia appeared in the kitchen doorway. The walls were thin, and her timing was impeccable, wearing the expression of a woman who had anticipated this scene and prepared her response. She said, gently, that she hoped we weren't fighting because of her, that the last thing she wanted was to cause tension, that she had always thought of me as a daughter, and it pained her deeply that things had developed this way. "Patricia," I said, and my voice was so level and so quiet that both of them looked at me with new attention. "There are no structural repairs, are there?" She began a sentence about misunderstandings. I did not let her finish it. "The November visit, the closet space. You were measuring the room." The kitchen was very quiet. She was looking at me now with something that had shifted beneath the performance. Less sorrow, more calculation. Less warmth, more the face a plan makes when it is being interrupted. I turned to Daniel. "I spoke to an attorney. The amendment is being challenged on the basis of unilateral modification without primary leaseholder consent. I have documentation of when it was filed and that I was not present or informed. Your mother has 30 days to establish alternative arrangements. After that, we will seek a formal removal order." Daniel sat at that table for a long moment after Patricia retreated to the living room. His hands were flat on the surface in front of him, the way they were when he was trying to hold himself still. He said, finally, "I didn't think she'd actually go through with any of this. I thought it would just work itself out." I looked at him. 4 years of a man who believed that things worked themselves out. 4 years of me being the person who worked them out while he waited to see if they would. "Nothing works itself out, Daniel," I said quietly. "Someone always does the work, and it was never her." He didn't answer. I think it was the first time he had heard it said plainly enough that the words had nowhere to go except in. In the hallway, I could hear Patricia moving through the living room with the particular deliberate sounds of a woman making herself present without technically interrupting. That quality of hovering, that monitoring. I had been living with it for 12 days, and the 12 days had felt like a rehearsal for a life I wanted no part of. I picked up my bag. "Call me when you're ready for an honest conversation about what you decided and why," I said. "Until then, I have nothing else to say." And I walked out of my apartment, into the elevator and the lobby and the night air outside, and I did not look back. The 30 days that followed were mine. Helen filed the challenge within the week, and the property management company, embarrassed to have processed an amendment without the primary leaseholder's signature, cooperated fully. Patricia, confronted with actual legal consequence, underwent a swift and revealing transformation. The warmth evaporated, the sorrowful framing dissolved, and what replaced it was a woman looking for the nearest exit that preserved the most dignity. She moved into a friend's spare room within 3 weeks. Derek followed, because Derek always followed the available accommodations. Daniel and I separated for 6 weeks. He stayed with a colleague, I stayed in my apartment, and slept without insomnia for the first time in months. We had long, honest conversations, the kind that don't resolve everything, but establish, finally, the true ground under your feet. He had not designed the plan, but he had not stopped it. He had allowed himself to believe that his mother's comfort and my rights could occupy the same space without conflict, which was not naivety, but a choice he had been making his entire life and had never been required to account for until now. We went to counseling. We established, explicitly and in terms that left no room for interpretation, what partnership required and what it no longer permitted. Patricia has not been inside our apartment since the evening I walked out. The lease amendment was formally revoked 4 weeks after I filed the challenge. The counseling was difficult in the way that honest things are difficult. Not dramatically, but with the sustained effort of two people learning to say the things they have trained themselves to root around. Daniel's relationship with his mother changed. Not completely. She was still his mother, and he was still, in some foundational way, the boy who had been shaped by her. But the shape of the relationship shifted. He stopped preemptively managing her needs at my expense. He started, slowly and imperfectly, choosing differently. Whether this was enough is a question I am still answering. Some days the foundation feels thinner than I'd like. On those days, I remind myself that I am not a person to whom things simply happen. I am a person who checks the lease. That spring, I repotted the basil on the windowsill. One of the terracotta pots had cracked during the weeks of upheaval, and I replaced it with a slightly larger one in a deeper shade that I liked better. The new plant took well. The kitchen smelled green and alive on the mornings I opened the window, and the western lights still came through at 4 o'clock and still turned everything that warm, particular gold. My copper pans hung where they had always hung. The apartment was exactly the size it had always been, and it felt, finally, the way it had felt the first day I walked through it and understood it was mine. Not smaller with the weight of other people's decisions pressed into every corner, but exactly right. Enough. Fully, uncomplicatedly mine. Some things you build, some things you have to reclaim. The difference, I have learned, is mostly a matter of being willing, when the moment finally comes, to stop being manageable.